small grain growth and the development. And by small grains, I'm really talking about the winter cereals, which would be primarily wheat and barley, but there's also some triticale and oats that are grown in the state. So when you look at the growth of these winter cereals, you really have a few distinct stages. And here you see it broken into the leaf and tiller development stage. And so early on, these crops are essentially a bundle of leaves. And then you get to a stage called stem elongation, and that's where the rapid growth typically occurs. And then after that, you'd have the head emergence and flowering, and then grain development. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through in a few slides later. I'm going to go through some of the individual some of these individual stages. But first, I want to just say why it's important to know stages. And one is when you think about stand evaluation, that usually occurs when you have one or two leaves out, and so that's an important time to come out. Also, for weed control, a lot of herbicides require that you apply the herbicide at a specific stage of growth of the crop, and also for the weeds. Some weeds, like wild oats, for example, have similar growth stages to some of these wheat and barley crops. The other is for insect control, and typically in barley, you might, for example, control aphids somewhere between the one node and late boot stage. There's certain growth regulators that can be applied, and for an old growth regulator is called Cerone that had a very, very tight window that you had to be applied near the flag leaf, the boot stage. In the case of Kernel bunt, which actually is more of a, if you know that, it's more of a political disease than a biological disease. But for that particular disease, it required some moisture just as the head was coming out. Then the other is the timing of the first and particularly the last irrigation, and I'll talk about the last irrigation near the end. And then the other is that when you look at fertilization, there's fertilization that's done for yield, and also in the case, especially of durum wheat, for protein. And typically the protein applications are done for a little bit around flowering or shortly thereafter. If you look at herbicides, I just put a list of some of the herbicides, just an example to show you the timing of some of these various herbicides. For example, there's many of them like Tacoma and Clarity where you need to apply it by the 5 to 6 leaf stage. There's others, MCPA, for example, that's 3 leaf to boot. So, and if you applied herbicides outside of these growth stages, you can cause crop damage. There's also when you look at the fertilizer and irrigation schedules, often we talk about maybe the first irrigation after the germination irrigation being needed somewhere around the 4 to 6 leaf stage. It depends, of course, on soil type and whether or not you had rain. And also the last irrigation you could see is usually required somewhere between the soft dough and hard dough stages. And similarly with fertilizers, you could see fertilizer applications, which we typically spoon feed or apply fertilizer for these crops in almost every irrigation, as you can see in the lower part of this slide. So here is the example of on the left of a plant in the a wheat plant in the 1 leaf stage, and you could see one thing that you would notice is that the first leaf, it's called the cotyledon leaf, and it has a rounded shaped tip, and you can see that right here uh, and this would be the second leaf here. And that's very important because when you go out and try to count what leaf stage you're at, it's often kind of hard. You want to find that first leaf. And so I just want to point that out. The first leaf has a rounded tip and the other ones are kind of have a sharper shaped tip. So then around the 3-leaf stage, here I'm showing a 4-leaf plant, you start the tillering. And this is when it gets difficult because you start seeing tillers come out. And so here's an example. Somewhere it's kind of hard to see. Somewhere at the base of the plant, you have a tiller, which is actually, if those of you don't know what a tiller is, it's another shoot that develops off the mother plant. And so in this drawing, you could see the main plant, and you see you got 1, 2, 3, 4 leaves, and the 5th leaf coming out. But then these leaves that are not dark but light colored, these would be the tillers coming out. And so this plant would have the main stem would have 4 leaves, and then these tillers would have 3 leaves, just as an example. And typically, when we talk about the number of leaves on the plant, we're talking about the main stem and not the tillers. And so this gets a little bit difficult. What you need to do when you start counting these leaves is to identify the tillers and then only count the leaves on the main stem. The other is when you're counting leaves, you might notice that if we look at this 4-leaf plant, like this looks like the first leaf. It's kind of hard to see because that the tip is starting to desiccate, but these leaves occur in an opposite to each other. So this would be the first leaf, and the next leaf is going to be opposite right there. And you say, well, about this one, this is a tiller coming out right here. So you have 1, 2, then the third one is right here, and the 4th one here. And so when you're counting leaves, it helps to know, first of all, what the first leaf is. And you know that they occur, each leaf occurs opposite each other on the stem as they progress. And so then I'm skipping the 5-leaf and 6-leaf stages. Now here we start getting into the stage, it's called the 1-node stage, or this would be called early tillering. Early jointing. Some people call it stooling. And it's called the 1-node stage because you literally have 1 node above the ground. And so in this drawing, you could see, of course, the main stem, which is in dark color. And if you were to peel away these leaf sheaths, you'd see this first node. And you could actually feel it if you ran your hand or fingers up and down the stem. It's a little bit easier when you pull away these the covering along the stem, the leaf sheaths. And so this would be the first node stage. And from here on, the plant grows very, very rapidly. So here's an example of a 2-node stage. And so here you could see a node here. I'm assuming I'm assuming this is a second. I guess the first, you'd have a node right here, then the second node right here, and well, here we see another node right here. So when you go from 1 node to 2 node, and sometimes 3 nodes, and the reason we go from counting leaves to counting nodes is because, if I may back up, once you're at this stage, it starts getting difficult. Once you get to the 1-node stage, it starts getting difficult to count leaves. And that's because the lower leaves start desiccating and they literally disappear. If you really, really need to figure out how many leaves you have on the plant, one thing that I've done is you can mark the plants. And so you come back to the same plant each time, and you could even mark the leaves. And so you can mark which is 1 leaf, 2 leaf, 3 leaf. You don't always have to mark each one. And so, for example, if you mark the 3rd leaf with a with a marker, just make a mark across the leaf blade, and you could do that with with you could put one mark on the one leaf on the third leaf, and you could put 2 marks on the 5 leaf, different things like that, so that if you really wanted to follow the leaves, you could do that. With the most of our wheat plants, varieties, they develop about 9 or 10 leaves. So, but once you get to about about the 5 or 6 leaf stage, and it starts getting difficult to count the leaves. And so once the plant starts having this stem elongation, then it's a little bit easier to start counting the nodes. And that's why we start counting nodes instead of leaves. And so you eventually get to a stage which it's just called the flag leaf visible stage. And the flag leaf, for those of you who don't know that term, that is actually the last leaf. And so it's it's a little bit hard to see, but in this is an example here where you could see this leaf coming out as the last leaf, and you could see the collar. You don't see the collar of the flag leaf, but you see the collar of the second to last leaf right here. And then this would be the flag leaf. Similarly, this would be the flag leaf right here. This is the flag leaf right here. And so here you see a stage what they call the flag leaf collar visible. And so this is the second to last leaf. Sometimes it's called the penultimate leaf. And then right here you have the flag leaf. But now you see this collar visible. And so that's when you're at that stage, you know that the stage after that is what they're called in the boot. Once you see this is the emerging grain head. Once you see this emerging grain head splitting the leaf sheath, this is actually near the end of the boot stage. And if you look at the flag leaf collar visible stage, this grain head is emerging, and it's probably around right here at the lower, kind of below this second collar. Once you get to the boot stage, you know the heads are going to be emerging pretty soon. So this is the heading stage, and some people call it spike emergence. And the thing about heading, there's a lot of people can define it differently, but typically the way you could define heading is when 50% of the plants have a head emerged. And so in this case, this plant has a head emerged. It's not fully emerged, but the head is emerging. And this head in this case is almost fully emerged because the base of the head is almost past the leaf collar. And so sometimes, like I said, it gets confusing. When you say heading, are you talking about how much heading? And so typically we use either first heading or 50% heading. And the same with flowering, they'll use terms like first flower, 50% flower. And it usually refers to what percentage of the stems have a plant that has any flowers at all. And so typically when you look at the grain head, the flowering usually starts in the middle part of the head, and then it progresses to the bottom part, then the top part of the head. And the flowering stage is important because this stage is most susceptible. It's where it's most susceptible to frost damage. And this flowering stage, as an example, could last anywhere between 3 and 5 days. So now after flowering, you get into these various stages of kernel development. And so if you were to pull apart the, let me go back one. If you were to pull apart these structures right here, this is actually called the lemma and palea. If you were to pull apart these botanical structures, you would be able to see the developing grain. And when it looks like this, it's what they call a kernel watery stage. And these are very descriptive stages. It's called kernel watery because if you crush these kernels in between your thumb and forefinger, you get a watery liquid that would come out. And generally, when you go through these stages from, I'll say from heading to flowering to kernel watery and these other stages that I'll show, it's roughly a week between each stage, just as a rule of thumb. It just depends obviously on weather, when you planted and your location. But generally these progress a week, plus or minus a few days, depending on the stage. So after this kernel watery stage, you get to a stage called milk. And literally that's descriptive in that if you were to press the developing kernel between your thumb and forefinger, you get what you see, kind of a milky substance that emerges when you squeeze it. And then the stage called soft dough is literally, you could see the grain is starting to turn color just a little tiny bit. But soft dough really refers to the consistency of the inside of the developing grain, and it's literally doughy, and it's not as glistening as you see with the milk stage, and it has a doughy appearance, and almost like when you're making bread. The soft dough stage is important, and because in our state, actually now probably about half the winter cereals we grow are for forage, and oftentimes the forage, this is for cattle feed, is either cut at the boot stage or the soft dough stage. So that's why it's important to know how you determine soft dough and why it's an important stage. The other thing is when you're growing small grains, or say wheat, for example, for grain, it requires about 3.5 inches of water to go from soft dough to a stage we're call physiological maturity. So 3.5 inches of water is about one irrigation. And so if you had irrigated at this stage on a sandy loam soil, if you had irrigated at the soft dough stage, you probably will not need any more irrigation water. That would be your last irrigation on a sandy loam soil. On a very sandy soil, you may need another one. On a heavier soil, clay soil, you might be able to get your last irrigation could be sooner than the soft dough soil, a soft dough stage. Now these two stages, the hard dough and the physiological maturity stages, are also important. Hard dough is a stage that occurs maybe a week or so after the soft dough stage, and that's where the you can still divide the kernel with your thumb and forefinger, but it's the dough has a much harder consistency than at soft dough. And then when you get to maturity, it's a physiological maturity is the point where no more dry matter accumulates in the grain. And so at this point, it doesn't need any more water. No irrigation water is going to help the crop. It is done. It's just in the stage where it dries down, where the grain dries down. The grain at that stage is about 35% moisture. No more dry matter accumulates, and there's a dry down stage of 2 to 3 weeks where it goes from 35% moisture to less than 10%, which is when we would harvest. And so a lot of times, I see, sometimes, I should say a lot of times, sometimes I see farmers will be still irrigating the crop past this maturity stage, and it's really not doing the crop any good because it's done. So here's what they call harvest ripe, and at this stage, the straw is dry. Of course, the kernels are hard, and they may be less than 10% moisture, and that's when you'd be at the harvest ripe stage. So I think this is my last slide. Let me check. Yeah. So that's my last slide, and I'd be more than happy to take any questions here or on chat after we're done. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. And
yes,
again, if you have question for Mike, you always can chat him on the the chat box, or you can call him or email. I think you have this information from Mike. So next we'll have